Thought Leaders, brought to you by the Geelong College OGCA.
My name's Mike Howell. I'm the Director of Community Relations, and welcome to our fourth webinar in the OGCA Thought Leaders series, where the Geelong College Principal, Dr. Peter Miller, will host a conversation with our special guest, John Wardle, on the art of architecture and designing the future of education. But before I hand over to Dr. Peter Miller, I'd like to provide some background on John Wardle. John is one of the most sought after architects in Australia, and he was recently honoured with Australia's top architecture award, the Gold Medal. He is internationally renowned for making extraordinary buildings. John grew up in Geelong and actually started his life as a student of Campbell House on screen and completed his year 12 in 1974. He established his now multi-award winning architecture practice, John Wardle Architects, in Melbourne in 1986, and has led the growth of the practice from working on small domestic dwellings to university buildings, museums, and large commercial projects. John Wardle Architects have published 2 books, Volume and The Building Likes Me, and a companion book to their 2018 Venice Biennale exhibit, Somewhere Other. The practice produced a master plan for both Geelong campuses back in 2015, and then commenced work on the design of the new junior school, which was completed at the beginning of this year. John utilised the original buildings that were once his own classrooms when he was a student in House. And John Wardle Architects is continuing to work with the Geelong College on the master plan for both campuses. So welcome, John, and I'll hand over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Mike, and welcome, John. It's
good to be here.
It's lovely,
and Peter, this evening.
And thank you to everybody who's joined us. We've got nearly 50 people, which is just terrific, and it's very nice in this Thought Leader series to have a range of people, and the links are available. Mike can give some more details later. Certainly to you, John. Look, thank you for your willingness to be involved in this. Look, the first question that we've got is John. We all know that you grew up in Geelong and that you actually attended college as a boy, from a very little boy. Tell us about your connections to the college. Significant family ones for you. Just tell us about that.
Yes, I'm very happy to do that, Peter. I'm very proud of my lifelong association with the school that I grew up with in Geelong. I attended, first off, the combined kindergarten, the Morongo and Geelong College kindergarten, then went there, and right through school to my HSC year. I'm not sure that I was a student that stood out a lot. I was looking through my various books. I think I won a drama prize one year and an academic third prize another one. I think that's probably the subtotal. I did better at athletics, but academically, I think I drifted through school as a very happy-go-lucky kid. I did have strong links with the school beyond my own time there. My father, Brian Wardle's a teacher at both the junior and senior school. He managed that, I think, to dodge the education of 2 sons, David and myself, as we went from one school to the other. He'd flip back from one campus to the other so as not to actually have to teach his own sons. His nickname was Truck Wardle because in his early stages at the school, he with another teacher, Jack Firth, drove 2 World War II trucks right through Central Australia with a truckload of young college boys investigating what must have been at that time a remarkable experience in Central Australia. Frank Rolland, august and famous headmaster, was my grandfather's first cousin, but the Reverend A.J. Campbell, who came out, he was a Presbyterian minister from Scotland, was my great-grandfather. So that association is something that I'm very proud of and goes back from many, many generations.
Well, regardless of your architectural qualifications, you're well qualified to have some input into this place because there's a bit of it around running through your vein. Any early influences for you on your career and your professional interests and your movement from school and into the world of architecture and beautiful buildings?
Yes, yeah. Look, I was well educated at Geelong College. I had a great art teacher, Brian camp, Cliff Barley taught me the wonders of European history, which I've really had as an ongoing interest ever since. But interestingly enough, we lived opposite Neil Everest, and I think I thought their household was more interesting than my own. I spent many weekends over in Neil's household, and I was a good friend of his son Richard. And then when we moved to Heathfield Court on the edge of the Barwon in Newtown, the Leggett House, a really wonderful house of Neil's, was being constructed, and I was transfixed by it. I walked through its construction process many afternoons after school and through the weekends. And I think if I had to say there was any one moment, I think that was probably a moment when I saw just the wonders of building buildings, and that attracted me greatly. I have rather romantic recollection of a thing that I must give my father credit for. He was, as a teacher at Geelong College, was also a member of the Geelong Historical Society, and was hell-bent on preserving Geelong at that time in the 60s, as it was being thoroughly demolished. And you can see as we look around Geelong that they weren't the most successful organisation in keeping many of the old buildings. But he was a good friend of Ken Burns, the wrecker, who wrecked all these buildings. And we would have many Saturday mornings, my father and myself, at Ken Burns' yard, while Dad would argue with Ken, but then thankfully take all the memorial stones from each of the places he demolished for a large wall that we created in Mercer Parade, and many other aspects. And I think there I got this both appreciation that people could have diverse views in life, but could settle their scores with a sort of a real sort of sense of decency. But also, Ken Burns' yard for me was a catalogue of the things that we build buildings, and you had out in the yard all of the detritus of the crude bits of timber and stone and brick just sitting out there in the weather, but in these massive industrial sheds, all the fine things, the things that showed the worth of human endeavour, the finials and staircases and windows. And I think I just got that sort of essay of endeavour and craft probably from those Saturday mornings at Ken Burns' yard.
And the way they tell the story of the places, and there they all are stacked up. Is the wall of Mercer Parade still there? Do you know?
Yes, it is. Yes, it's full of both stones, all from Ken Burns' yard, and a series of memorial stones. The one thing it hasn't got is Dad, again with his passion for history, with the Peter Law, after the Eureka Stockade, was taken wounded and hidden in his sister's house in Geelong. And when Ken Burns demolished his sister's house, Dad grabbed the front step, sure that it had Peter Lawler's blood infused in this one small, rather ordinary bit of basalt, and that came with them from every single house they had from there on.
All right. Oh, how extraordinary.
Yeah.
But moving on to your own practice, and you set up your practice in 1986, and then completed a Master of Architecture. What can you tell us about particularly your early days in your practice as a young budding architect in the mid-80s?
Well, much of it I've excised from memory, because it's pretty miserable often starting an architectural practice. I often say there was nothing within me genetically that made me prepared me for such a thing. I came from generations of teachers and accountants and public servants. And so to head out into the business world of running a practice, I found immeasurably difficult. We were a very slow practice to take off, and did years and years of small domestic work before getting our first ever major commission, which was actually for the CSIRO, a research building for the CSIRO. And then their Wool Technology building in Geelong was a very early one. So they were slow and steady improvements until the point whereby really a series of competition wins, we sort of announced ourselves as a practice that had skills beyond doing backs of houses, which we did for many years.
So exciting and nerve-wracking, I imagine.
Yeah, it was, yes. Yeah.
Exactly. And these days, 2020, a very different world for you, but obviously it's a competitive market and competing for business. What would you like to share about those sorts of things?
Well, certainly I'm somebody who's always been very dependent on others, and within our practice, it's now a large practice. But this idea of the worth of many and improving what we do by willingly including others in the process has been sort of one of the mantras of the practice. and this is our Melbourne studio. We also have a smaller studio in Sydney, but this idea of the coming together of many bright minds has been really a big part of it. A few years ago, we celebrated our 30th anniversary, and this book was launched. And in getting a speech ready for the book launch, I sort of wanted to work out this equation of many people, and I thought about their DNA. So I quickly asked all of my staff, could they quickly give me the statistics of how many universities they were educated from, and what countries they were born in, and what countries their parents were born in. And it produced this extraordinary equation of the DNA of our practice that spanned really the entire globe. And it became a fascination. We had a year's celebration of these DNA, of our collective DNA, of lunches and dinners and talks and things. And at the end of it, I designed this bowl. I have an interest in ceramics, and I designed this bowl called the Upside Down at the Bottom of the World bowl. It comes out of a quote that was written some years ago about our state of where we exist in Australia is upside down at the bottom hemisphere of the vast world. So here we are, adhered by gravity, upside down at the bottom of the world. And so that was the name of the bowl that was given out to all of our staff at the end of that period of year of celebration. Another recent highlight was we were invited, I think the first Australian practice to do so, to be invited in to exhibit in our own right in the Arsenale at Venice, at the Venice Biennale in 2018. And that image of this work, it was made in Geelong. It was constructed by Jacaranda Industries, a remarkable outfit of very talented people in a vast industrial shed in Corio, and then transported there in 16 containers to this place where it was in the midst of this remarkable building, the Arsenale building in Venice. And where it entertained people for 6 months until being brought back to Australia. Where was it? The NGV for 6 months, and now the Samstag Art Museum, the Contemporary Art Museum in South Australia that we designed some years ago, where it's just completed. And we've just won a wonderful award, the New South Wales Architecture Medallion, a few weeks ago for this building. This is one that's had a very long gestation, the Phoenix Art Gallery, that was completed earlier this year for arts patron Judith Nielsen, a remarkable commission, one of those very rare commissions you get in a career that we've celebrated greatly as a practice.
It's quite magnificent, and the beautiful light and space inside. I read somewhere though that you describe yourself as leading from the middle. Tell us about that.
Yes, well, I mean, certainly the practice has grown far beyond any earlier ambition that I had, and I don't think I was ever really considered to be a natural leader. And I've probably grown to lead a practice, but probably in my own style, which is one that I certainly very necessarily appreciate the skills of others. I mean, there's people in our practice with remarkable skills that I have either less of or none of. And so that our overall processes rely on many people coming together in a framework of collaborative engagement. So I think also the way I tend to work and to operate as a leader, I do lead from the middle of the pack. I'm just generally surrounded by others in whatever I do. I'm rarely a lone figure, and somehow probably in garnering enthusiasm, certainly hopefully a lot of the time in good humour, draw in the enthusiasms and appreciations of this vast group, and somehow encourage them to do their best work. And I think that's as more as an encourager that I manage to do these things. Probably one of the examples of this, one of the things that's very defining for our practice, we have a family farm on Bruny Island off the southeastern coast of Tasmania, and we go there as groups every year to make things. And it's a way of sort of reversing our understanding of things. Rather than us doing laborious drawings and having skilled others make things, those makers are our educators. And when over this period of time, we've had carpenters, joinery makers, blacksmiths, steel fabricators, stone masons, arborists, all sorts of people come and teach us how to make these sorts of objects along the coast. And this year, with 2 groups of 20, went down, we built a community table for the local community hall out of 8 old op shop tables. I described it as an argument in a table, which is very relevant to that community. with a great ceramicist friend of mine. Under his instruction, we built this wonderful ceramics kiln that sits there on the ocean edge. It looks more like a beached whale or a lost submarine than a kiln as it sits there near the house in glazed bricks from a favourite brickmaker in central Victoria, Kraus Bricks, who donated the bricks, and a small series of stone staircases and a bridge that crosses a spillway from a dam into the ocean. And then just looking here at sort of the metrics of how stone and timber can come together, and a small open bathhouse made from a $300 sheep trough lined with beautiful Japanese tiles to form an outdoor bathhouse that looks out across the ocean. So these are sorts of things unconventional in architectural practice normally that we find very defining in our way of working together. And certainly in these opportunities, I do lead from the middle. And as part of the house, the process that created these two houses down here, this one is the shearers' quarters, made for family, friends, staff, and the occasional shearers when they come here for their annual shearing on the property. So yeah, so that Bruni idea is a very defining aspect of this form of rather unconventional leadership I think I've developed over the years.
And we'll come to this shortly about the impact of that sort of approach and how that relates actually to contemporary schools, because I think what you've described is something of a contemporary, creative, collaborative work environment, which is something that we are working very strongly in our school towards, and we'll come to that shortly. In 2020, you were honoured with Australia's Top Architecture Award, which is called the Gold Medal. And in a document put together around that award, writer Richard Flanagan actually wrote this. He said that John discovers whole worlds in the most minute and too easily dismissed details and reimagines them as rooms, walls, buildings, and finally, communities. Better places to live, in other words, all of which is easily said, but only with difficulty realised. And what is it but the true mark of a master? An interesting sense of that, isn't it? But this accompanies, so this award and these sorts of things that are said about you, tell me, how does this, how do you feel that relates to actually what you're like and what you seek to do with your buildings? Yes,
it's interesting, and thank you. That quote, Richard Flanagan's a neighbour of ours on Bruny Island, and that's, you know, it's a very flattering and interesting observation he makes. It was one of a series of about, I think, 20 or people who wrote about the gold medal being awarded to me this year. Interesting enough, I don't think they described me as sort of this this massive character, of sort of a lion of the profession. The overall impression, if you read all of them, was sort of this rather daffy soul who collected odd objects and gathered together people in a harmonious sort of creative environment. And it's, in a way, it's sort of a very true picture. I think I have sort of created this sense of an architectural equation that draws people in. We will often find opportunities to bring in skilled others, skilled craftspeople, artists, certainly sometimes other architectural practices, and into this sort of broader collective. And I think sometimes architects in their anxiety tend to internalise and want to be the lone author, and I'm rarely that. I like the idea that authorship can be something that's jointly signifies the involvement of many people. So mine is an interesting gold medal award, and I think it celebrates probably my creation of a practice that has these credentials, but the practice itself, which is one of many bright people that come together in this creative coalition.
So with that group that comes together in your creative coalition, what do you think of the distinctive features of buildings designed by JWA? We've seen the images just now. We've probably all got a sense in our mind of what might be distinctive, but can you put some words around that? So if you explain to people who hadn't seen the images.
Yes, I mean, I often think our buildings exhibit almost the stories of their making. You know, the conversations with clients, the research we do, the lost history that can sometimes be drawn into a contemporary narrative for a building. And they are buildings generally imbued with a strong narrative and a sense of storytelling. I love hearing the stories of other people describe our buildings, and they are very much buildings that that tell stories and have evidence of the life of their occupants or their sense of purposefulness that the buildings create. I'm particularly pleased, I think, in the way that the practice has such a broad catalogue of buildings. We do family homes in both in urban environments and particularly in a lot of rural and coastal areas that seem to take up so much of our thinking and practice. They teach us many of the skills and interests we have that we translate from these to much larger projects. The sorts of appreciation we have of human experience within space takes us from a small family home such as that to a major city building that will be occupied by many people and take its place in the map of a city and understand its relationship to streets and the silhouette of a city and the shape and form that a city takes around both its history and its contemporary buildings. So the idea of doing this raft of breadth of projects that encompass from homes to larger buildings to cultural buildings and galleries and right through to education buildings is something that I'm enormously proud of. It's wonderful to have a practice that can harness the skills to be relevant, I guess, in so many broad areas of endeavour.
And interesting, that last building is actually the architecture building at Melbourne University. So that would have been a tough gig, I would have thought, to build a building for architects or design a building for architects.
Yeah. Well, we're suckers for that because that's the second of three. We're now doing our third. We did the University of South Australia.
Yeah.
I've just given my annual lecture, which ever since doing the building, I give an annual lecture to the students there, which I greatly enjoyed. I did this for the first time. I did it by not flying there, but by Zoom from my own study, and we're now doing one for Curtin University. But yeah, it is. I think now there's sort of, I think, an understanding we have as a practice about the aspects of teaching that we draw into so much of our architecture that makes us, what we do attractive for such commissions. We understand the pedagogical aspects of buildings, the way you can understand a building by looking at its structure and surface and details, and buildings can tell lessons such as the ones that we hope we're doing for you at the moment.
Look, and that's a nice little segue to the next one, which is really about your engagement here at college. In 2014, you were actually engaged by the school council to work on the 30-year master plan. So how did you feel about that? And then the first major project, which we decided to go with at about 2016, which was in fact the redevelopment of Campbell House. So I suppose the commission generally, the master plan, and then Campbell House specifically, perhaps. How do you feel about that? What was that like?
Yes, well, look, there was some trepidation. I remember I discussed with my father over many years as we tried to grow as a practice and find new clients. The one I never approached was Geelong College because of my association with Neil Everest particularly, and the respect that what a remarkable commission that McLeish and Everest had for 50 odd years. That's a rare privilege for architects, and I felt very sensitive about that. So when Hugh Seaward rang me up to actually invite me in to compete for this commission, I was enormously pleased, and I did let him know at that time of a few sensitivities, and there's a particular point where it looked like we may have been going to gain the commission, and I said two things. One, I'd like to speak to Neil Everest first, and the other one, I would like to feel I can talk openly about those buildings that have been, and parts of both campuses that have been a great success and are really worthy, and those that I think are less successful. If we can do a real master plan, we must look critically at every aspect of the campus. So it was a particularly telling series of conversations. I should say that I had the most wonderful conversation with Neil Everest, and he died, I think, about 7 or 8 months afterwards. But
beginning of 16.
Yes, he did say that yes, there was an air of disappointment because he was so pleased with that commission. But as he observed the growth of my practice over so many years, he was particularly pleased that anybody was going to take over that commission, it would be my practice. And interestingly enough, he sort of caused this to happen a little bit. There was, I can't remember what the reason was, but there was a large celebration at the school some years early, 5 or 6 years earlier, and it was suggested that Neil organised a exhibition of the work of his practice. And he said also, could I invite John Wardle, and we have these two firms, McClashin and Everest and John Wardle Architects, do parallel exhibitions of the work of both of their practices. So in a way, Neil did introduce us to this, which I feel particularly indebted to. But yeah, I felt it was a huge responsibility. It's hallowed ground for me, and a remarkable privilege. I was particularly pleased. And yes, and taking on the idea, I might just touch on the buildings later when we discuss it in a bit more detail, Peter, but the aspect of the master planning itself was wonderful, because we've been so deeply involved with all of the stakeholders that have come together, and at each stage we've been back renewing the master plan now a few years later over the course of the early stages of late last year and early this year. Yes. And just inviting in the thinking within the school, that we as architects really then have the job of making physical those remarkable ambitions and aspirations that a really fascinating collective of people have brought together. So for us, that has been a great joy. Really looking critically at the school, the structure of it and everything, but through a deep appreciation of what exists.
And there are challenges in that, aren't there? Because educational institutions are really inherently quite conservative in many ways, financially, perhaps even their vision and the function, and buildings can end up with just sort of a straight up and down function. So how do you overcome the resistance to some of your design solutions and challenge people's thinking, not just here at college specifically, but generally with the many different educational institutions that you work with?
Yes, well, a very good question. It's something that we spend a lot of time doing, that advocacy. The first thing is we'd always like to express an idea before it's a drawing. And so you'll notice in many of our discussions, we've talked by diagrams or sketches, or really just openly about the potential of an idea, and to involve our clients in the making and the realising of an idea. So part of it is that appreciation that we build buildings out of conversations, and they are manifestly that. We find the sensitivities, often the anxieties, and as well as the ambitions, and sort of craft generally a narrative, and very often with so many of these buildings, by the end of it, we're aware that the discussions themselves are being quoted by the stakeholders, and very often the students, the academics, and others that visit a campus get to know many of the stories that have been made along the way, and in a way we are building these stories. So establishing these strong narrative of buildings that tell some specific process of their purpose, very often an aspect of the history of the site, or a particular relationship to a pattern within a street or a program. And so there's a sort of a logic. I often describe it as an invented logic. I like the word logic. It sounds like the truth. In fact, really it's something that is an invention of something that's generally specific to a particular problem. So we'll have what I often describe as invented logic, something that makes the aspirations sit and appear to work early. And so this aspect of drawing together and the sort of causal aspects of what the potential of building can do is really interesting. And that way there's something as, in fact, this is a good slide to just sit on for a moment, is relatively illogical to this, can have a story that actually binds it into place. Well, again, with my interest in ceramics, with my family, had burdened them with a trip to Stoke-on-Trent, probably England's least interesting 21st century city, but it was the home of their remarkable ceramics industry. And they had these amazing pottery kilns. And I, through a discussion with the Vice-Chancellor of Monash University, I talked about the idea of making this centre of the building appear like a massive kiln, and seeing telling the parable of the relationship between that high firing process of the raw matter of clay to make it both durable and purposeful in the beauty of a piece of ceramics is very similar to the intensive tertiary education on the raw matter of young students. And she bought the store and we built the building. So these sort of stories then become ways of actually linking people and linking their understanding of the potential of an idea in the creation of a building. And that sort of can harmony, again, just the raft thing. Very often, like in our conservatory, it might be solving a particular acoustic issue and looking at how we can have a major plenary hall that actually had outlook to the world beyond, but an acoustic screen or the nature of windows that can operate, that then become part of, quite playfully often, the architecture of the building, but really are solving very pragmatic issues.
And some magnificent spaces indeed. I remember walking in for the first time into the slide that you paused on. For people may not be familiar with the building, but that's the education building at Monash University. And when I walked in there, and it was somewhere between walking through a great big cave or an industrial space, it was quite a little bit disconcerting. And then when you told me later that the inspiration for that was in part from Stoke-on-Trent, which you just described as perhaps one of the least interesting 21st century cities in the UK, I would agree with. I lived in Nottingham for a year, and I rode there in Stoke-on-Trent, and it's not very interesting. So I think they'd be really pleased that such an extraordinary building was inspired by something from there. So it's very true. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful space, so flexible and vast, but it draws and carries you through, which is lovely. Well, I just want to draw on, I want to talk a little bit about place, and many people know that I'm a geography teacher, and I struggle to think of anything much beyond place. I think it's very much at the heart of it, of what we do and how we create a sense of place. Rufus Black, the current Vice-Chancellor at University of Tasmania, and before that he was the Master at Ormond College, which is well known to many of our our old collegians. Rufus wrote this. He said, "Working with John is an invitation to a creative journey shaped by his passion for place and material, by his capacity to reimagine a project's possibilities, and by kindness." Your architectural ideas seem to emerge from an understanding of place and a desire to create a sense of place. So tell us about what you think is important in creating that sense of place.
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by why we find how spaces operate and why some work and some less so. And generally something is something about a collective understanding. You know, it brings a community together to a central space, or a space that's defined as central to the community. For that sort of sense of placefulness, often to me, has to have a deep understanding of history. I always like to know, as contemporary as we like to be, I think to understand our place in that vast continuum of history is only really relevant if we understand the history that's brought us to where we are in our contemporary situation. So I don't think we would have ever done a job of any type or scale without deeply researching the history of what's gone on before there. And now, I know, as particularly I know the school is so interested in is in a greater understanding of Indigenous settlement. We now far more inclined as a generation to look back into the layers of history, right back to a greater understanding of Indigenous settlement. And that's added huge depth of understanding, particularly the way we treat landscape. And for us, that the sense of landscape has been always profoundly set. I must boast, I also have a qualification in horticulture. I thought I didn't have it in me to go and do landscape architecture after I finished my architecture qualification. But with my wife, Susan and we studied horticulture at Burnley, that the vocabulary of landscape, the nature of the botanical species that actually assist in our understanding of regions is something I think is also profoundly interesting. But I think more than anything, it's what makes places specific. What in a global society where so much can be the same, you know, shopping precincts can be the same the world over. What is it that makes us go to a place because it is specifically set and only there? To be there is to be nowhere else, and that drawing into the specifics of place is something we discussed with you all in the creation of the junior school. Is something that was so set and understood that it could happen nowhere else.
And that's being established, or certainly it's a feeling, isn't it, too? It's an emotional experience through a sense of place. And I was curious to see in what Rufus Black wrote that he actually describes your experience, and what you do is actually by kindness as well, which I thought was interesting. And I think we've seen evidence of that, sort of collecting the old bits of rubble. And there's a kindness and a healthy respect for things that have got a story, and it brings them forward. And there's a compassionate thing in that, which is, I don't think is often well understood, about that architects can be kind.
No, well, because the other side of architecture, obviously, sometimes you've got to be fairly dogmatic, and sometimes that side of my personality and for many architects comes out too. So it's good to balance it with some.
I meant about buildings, not about people, but that's. And the Campbell House development, so the whole of the junior school development it was a significant and bold undertaking, because in fact, not only with what we ended up with, but the whole process of construction was quite bold, because the description we had was building an aircraft while flying it. But so because it is a blend, the whole complex is a blend of the old and new. What can you tell us about the design features and how it emerged to be the complex of buildings that we're absolutely enjoying at the moment, even though the children only had 7 weeks in them?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it is, again, it comes back to history. I think it's history finding a new version of itself in the same way that the Reverend Campbell brought his sort of ideas and ambitions from another hemisphere, and through discussion and landscape and things made them something completely different in establishing the first campus, through really the brief that the school wrote. Really have done much the same thing, taking the Reggio brief, something that was actually born in another society on the other side of the world, and bringing that to Australia, but somehow changing it inexorably to the point where it became our own, is really, again, now part of the school's history. So it follows a map that's been set for many, many years. And it's been really a profound brief that understands aspects of scale and the sorts of things that the human condition responds well to. It has a village character that was always discussed as an essential aspect of this. And the outer wall is the outer wall of a village, and it's kind of, I guess, in a way, the toughest part of it is a protective surface of this brick outer wall, and it opens up to this sequence of spaces. We like the idea as architects, we sort of orchestrate a journey, and we can imagine you sort of, arriving as either a newcomer or day to day at the Waiapiri building, being greeted upon arrival, and coming through past early learning and then into this sequence of spaces set around the most dramatic landscape. And I must say, we can take very little credit, almost no credit, for that wonderful landscape that the school's created. It is wonderfully effusive, terribly messy, and containing, it's just the spirit of activity, as good as any landscape I've seen, and the school must be commended for that. But our architecture worked with that, and the idea of assembling something as an outer layer that contains a village-like experience within, I think, is really important. So we hope it doesn't appear hostile, but very much a walled village that is only really understood once you're invited in, as the college will always do, to invite the community in, to appreciate it upon entrance into the village, where the life of the village is understood and profoundly set. So whereas the outside is relatively singular, it's got the 1960s fair old pattern. I think all of us were tortured by mothers that knitted us fair old jumpers. We see that in the nature of the brickwork, but then there's something that doesn't actually tell the whole of its story, and the story is really opened up and told once you're invited into the centre and infused with the landscape. That sequence of spaces then unfold to provide a greater understanding of the educational experiences and the social and community experiences that will be contained within.
And what we didn't have any photographs thereof, perhaps, was we had a lot of the outsides and some of the areas, but the inside spaces are just extraordinary and very, very, well, I'll say contemporary, but ahead of their time. And I really believe in terms of the way that the layout and the way that learning can take place collaboratively, honouring a Reggio Emilia approach. It can really will take place, and the spaces enable that. So for the people in the audience, when there will be opportunities, we're looking for those in the future when we're allowed to have people to come through and to just get a sense of what John is actually talking about. And probably the real test is that the children love the spaces and they love their classrooms, and it's just brilliant. And so too do the teachers. So it's a real treat. Looking ahead though, buildings that you're looking forward to designing in the future here at college.
Yes, well, it's interesting, and we actually head toward an immediate future that's sort of unknown in so many ways with COVID-19. But perhaps out of that will become the ambition to do the first building, which really interesting is most likely to be a gymnasium project, and for a few reasons. First, by moving the gymnasium, we're starting to open up the centre of campus for other possibilities, mainly for more learning spaces to occur at the heart of campus. But by displacing it out to the western edge of the campus, the idea for a new gymnasium that contains community spaces, it'd be very much it's open to a broader usage, but to an understanding of a gymnasium as a very lively educational space. It will contain classrooms and all sorts of aspects of the instructive nature of the education to human well-being. So a really lively, big, raw and open space, possibly employing some really quite remarkable new timber construction technology. Very new forms of construction technology will exist, and it will be oriented out toward the Mackey Oval and back into the heart of campus. That's most likely currently is new. There'll be some interesting work we've been doing recently on a very exciting project that one day will be a new front door for many people when arriving at the school, as well as all of the myriad of projects that are projected within the master plan for both campuses.
And there has been a real sense, though, hasn't there, of creating buildings and spaces that fit what we've got, but also lay a format or a structure, a flow around the place for many years to come. And our master plan that we've just revised, and you guys have revised and we've worked collaboratively on, it actually doesn't finish the school, does it? So there's a bit of restraint in it. It leaves space for things later, which I quite like.
Yes, so it must, as a master plan, to be a durable master plan, it must have enormous amounts of flexibility for the future. And one of the key things it is doing is actually opening up the potential for future development as a consequence of some of these early new building programs. Which is very exciting.
Look, it is exciting. Look, one more question that I've got. We've been quite remarkably disciplined in not talking about COVID-19, so I'm actually not going to ask a question about it. I just wanted to capture the moment to say that, to remind everybody here that we've actually had about 45 minutes without talking about it, which is just to encourage you that it is possible. The final question, I should say, there are some interesting things in there about your collaborative approach, and there are many questions that I'd like to explore around that with you. The closing question is a selfish one. What I love about the Reggio approach, and having had the good fortune of going to Reggio Emilia, which is actually a city in northern Italy, one of the wonderful, beautiful turn of phrases, and it sounds better if you say it with an Italian accent and you've got a coffee or a glass of wine in your hand, is that the beauty is in the aesthetic. And I do find that in the buildings and the spaces and the places that they're actually created. Trying to get our young people to have their eyes up and to appreciate that is important. I have a son, and this is true, and don't anybody say this is within the cone of silence of this group, who's actually just wanting to do architecture at RMIT. And I'm quite thrilled about that because I think hopefully he's been paying attention. But what advice have you got to young people who are looking for a career in architecture, in design, in creating, given where we're at? Are we in a modular world where things don't need to be created, everything is functional, or is there an opportunity for this breadth, creativity around buildings, places, and spaces where we live? What would you say?
I'll answer that, Peter, with all the bias of an architect. I mean, I could start by saying there could be no greater calling, but perhaps I better not say that. I mean, it's a very rewarding profession. There are very few professions that enable you to see the worth of what you do, because it's constructed, and if it's any good, it lasts a long period of time. It's probably akin to school teaching, where you see the worth of what you do in those children that come out the other end of the process. So I think there's probably a similarity actually between teaching and architecture. But there are many, more than most professions, it does allow you to provide strong evidence of your work, which I think is good. I think, look, I think it's no more relevant a time than now, as people are stuck indoors, and when we leave our confinement, we have more confinement in Melbourne than most of you in regional Victoria and Geelong are enjoying at the moment, but we'll be going back to workplaces that now must change. And architects and other related design professionals will be at the forefront of that. Our sort of the immediacy by which architects can do research. A good architect is generally a great observer. We innately observe the world around us. I notice when I talk to other architects, I see, and certainly when I talk to architecture students, I talk about getting out and making observations and coming to conclusions about the patterns that exist, the history that's evident, the understanding of things that really are quite symbolic about the physical environment. So I would say it's a really interesting. It's not the highest paid profession as an employee, as a salaried employee. It is one of the hardest working ones. For some reason, it's always the architecture students at university that seem to be wanting to get keys into the faculty because they want to work till 2 o'clock in the morning, when the others seem to be able to get through their courses very readily by going to bed at a reasonable time. And that seems to then go right through their professional life. There is something about, I think it is one profession that, unless you've got a passion for it, you wouldn't do it. There are other professions that you can have a reasonable level of ambition and have a good career. The architects that do well generally are very passionate people, and I think the sense of seeing the good in what you can do and trying to seek out opportunities to build responsibly, build well, mean that you have to have that additional aspect of passion for what you do. The good thing about it, I don't think you have to just see that you've been a particularly creative school child that can draw remarkably or anything. I mean, I draw incessantly. I'm a massive drawer. I have the messiest drawings that I produce, and I often describe them as drawings as a conversation. They're generally done with others and at haste, but they embody sort of ideas and things. There are so many ways to be an architect, and it's such a broad profession now. You can be somebody that takes a strong lead in environmental initiatives, as more building sciences, as an architect that gets involved in aspects of community projects, and then there's all of the other conventions of the different areas that architects work within. So I wouldn't feel worried and confined that you feel certain credentials other than a passion for the way the built environment occurs and the human experience that's contained in it.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate that. I love the sense that a good architect is a great observer. Well, it's been really lovely to share some time with you, John, and thank you for being so generous in giving that to us. It is exciting. It is a wonderful thing. As I said, that junior school redevelopment is quite remarkable, and I'm hoping that everybody in time will have an opportunity to come through there. The Waiapiri, the hall, is a particularly magnificent spot. The children walk in and they just draw the energy from the space. It's slightly asymmetrical. It's got lights. It's got this cathedral ceiling, and it's a little bit wonky. and they just go, oh, wow, and it captures them and away they go. And it's a really lovely thing in a positive way. So thank you for enabling those sorts of interactions. To see the children interact with the spaces is the great joy that we have as teachers. The other thing, just to say, architecture and teaching, are they similar? Ours aren't fully formed when we finish with them. Hopefully yours as an architect. Yours
That's a good difference.
Just a thought.
Yeah.
So anyway, look, thank you, John, so much. And thank you very much to everybody who's committed some time this evening. I hope that you've enjoyed it. Also, thank you very much to Mike for the initiative around this.
Thank you, Mike.
And it shows great depth in our old collegians and the wonderful community that we've got out there and amongst it. So it's a real thrill to have all of you involved, and particularly to hear from John this evening. So thank you so much.